Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to our September all call for the CIP. This month we will be talking about trauma audits and building a wellness environment. We are pleased to have on the line today a CIP director from Iowa, Ms. Kathy Thompson, who will be talking about operationalizing some recommendations that her state received on creating trauma-informed court practice and environment. One of our experts from the National Center for State Courts, Allison McKenzie, who's an architect and is an expert on courthouse design and creating trauma-informed court environments. We also have our Capacity Building Center for Court staff, Ms. Alicia Davis, Eva Klein, Scott Trowbridge, and myself, Melissa Guller. So to start out with, we thought it would be good for us to think about how you de-stress. And if you think about that for a moment and type how you do that into our chat box. I think this is interesting, especially given the time of year. Before we know it, the holidays will be here. So it's helpful, I think, to be mindful of how we can de-stress. So we'll take a couple minutes so that we can see that. And I love that everybody is exercising, running, and doing CrossFit. I think I need to take that up myself. There's some great responses on there, so thank you for participating in that. Before we begin our presentation today, I just want to set this up with letting you know that we've, in the past, done some presentations on our all-call around trauma, and today's presentation really builds on some of those past trauma presentations and is part of the information that we've been providing around procedural justice. And so moving toward creating a trauma-informed court system that supports families, includes physical space, and how environment can play an important role. At this time, we'll go ahead, and I believe that David Kelly is on the line, and we'll take a couple minutes should anyone have any questions for him. Okay. Should any questions come up, we do have we have one right now. Is there a CIP meeting scheduled in April of 2019, or is that something else?
Melissa, this is Jennifer Rennie. There is a CIP meeting scheduled in April 2019. And every other year, as folks know, we have the OCAN conference. So again, the CIP meeting will be held in the same time frame as the OCAN conference. I know it's the third week in April, and I'm sure that one of my colleagues has those exact dates at their fingertips. If not, I'll get that into the chat box shortly.
Great, thank you, Jen. And Rob, just let us know that NCAN is on April 24th through April 26th. Okay, well, if you have any other questions, please feel free to type them in, and we will collect those and get information back to you. So at this time, we will go ahead and turn it over to our presenters.
All right, well, thanks so much, Melissa. This is Alicia Davis with the Capacity Building Center for Courts. And I have next to me Allison McKenzie, who is my colleague at the National Center for State Courts. And we are really excited to talk to you about trauma-informed court design. We have had a lot of opportunities as a CIP community in the last year or so to discuss the various effects of trauma. We've certainly discussed it in the context of the child sex trafficking. We've talked about judicial-informed trauma and trauma-informed decision-making. And today we want to look at trauma from a little bit different perspective, and that is a physical perspective. So one of the things that we were reflecting upon when we were, kind of putting this together is that just as we know that court processes impact the way that parties are able to interact with their court process, it has a direct impact on their ability to integrate information. So does physical space. So at first blush, perhaps, this seems fluffy to talk about court design, but we really, and as Allison will be talking to us when she's talking about her experience as a court architect, we can really reflect on the fact that physical space impacts the participants' experience and their ability to interact. One of the experiences or one of the examples that comes to mind is, do you remember about 10 or so years ago when different CIP programs started to think about purchasing courtroom printers? And, and at first, like the first couple of requests that came in, perhaps it seemed like, like the court should be providing court printers. But, there was a recognition that parties, think about a mother who's just recently had her children removed, or a father, and they're in court and they're trying to receive this complicated court order and know what they're supposed to do on Monday to go drop a UA and, start attending their parenting classes or, start seeking housing, et cetera. So this is the same context. And so we'd like to underscore that trauma-informed design is important because it does a number of things. So certainly there is the parent perspective or the caretaker perspective in front of the dependency and neglect court. Trauma-informed design also ensures public safety. We encourage criminals. We want criminals to come to the courthouse, so obviously we need to make sure that we design it in a way that's as safe as possible. The way that the court is set up and structured can have a direct impact on the fair and impartial access to the justice process. Think about somebody that's standing behind some type of a barrier, a physical barrier, or somebody that doesn't have, access, their voice can't be heard in the courtroom. They've done studies on this too, when parties come into the court system, into the courthouse, and they're able to actually find signage and direction that helps them get to where they want to go, that actually has a direct impact on their perceptions of justice, which is interesting. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. Here's the learning objectives, and I already went through these, that we wanted to talk about the fact that trauma-informed court design is a recognized practice, not just for dependency and neglect courts or for juvenile courts or family courts, but more broadly, and that's what Allie is going to be talking about, that physical space has a direct impact on mood, which has a direct impact on decision-making and participation. And so what our objective is today is to consider ways that you as CIP coordinators or directors, you have the ability to really directly influence the design of space. And, maybe you're in that coveted position of being able to say maybe your court or one of your courts is designing a new space, and how lucky you are because you get to advise on how the court is actually put together and how the design goes. But even if you don't, even if you're working with older courthouses, as so many of us are, we wanted to provide some practical ideas of ways that you can work and retrofit that existing space. Before we hand over the figurative mic to Allie, I wanted to just highlight one of the courts that I've been particularly impressed by. And as we go through, we'll note the fact that there aren't a lot of tremendous examples of good use of space. What we were more able to find are examples of not so great use of space. So if you're familiar, if in your jurisdiction of some places that you think are exemplary in their design, in the way that they've taken into account the parent or the child or youth perspective, then we really want you to call those out and to make note of that in the chat. But let me just quickly walk you through some of the elements that we'll go into greater depth in, but I think are noteworthy and that certainly stand out as, as practices to be considered in other space. So in the top left corner there, that's actually their detention facility. And you may not, recognize it as a detention facility immediately. So, some of the things that you might notice are the lighting. It's got access to the actual sunlight, and sometimes we don't see that in detention facilities. You'll notice that they've used some comforting colors. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that same detention facility, and where someone's doing a bow pose for you yoga enthusiasts. Then, they offer yoga in that same space. So again, they offer classes there. They've got all kinds of different activities. They've really done an excellent job in transforming this detention facility into a real place of rehabilitation. And that's supported by the curriculum that they've designed, the different activities that they have available. To the left of the yoga, you'll see their library. And again, this looks like just a lovely, well-appropriated library that you might find in your community. And if you walk outside those doors, you go into a garden area where the youth there can reflect. There's also another space. Because they were able to significantly reduce their detained population, they actually took an entire part of the facility and they converted it to like a safe space, like a cooling off space. So let's say that there's a youth that has issues with their caretakers and just needs to blow off some steam rather than having it escalate into another type of a situation. Then, they actually created this really cool area with nice furnishings, and they've got Nintendo and cereal where people, where a kid can come and hang out for a few hours rather than staying in the home and potentially getting themselves into trouble or being removed from the home. So, certainly as we're looking at prevention efforts across the country, it's something to keep in mind. And then, we also just put a nice picture of their whole court hallway, and they've got some stuffed animals that move around, and, it's actually not a bad place to be. If you got to go to court, that's the kind of place you want to go. So anyway, those are just some of the items that we wanted to highlight, and let me go ahead and turn it over to Allie. And Allie, I'm going to turn the webcam on you too.
Oh, good.
Let's see if that works. Okay. All right.
Hi. So my name is Allison McKenzie. I'm a licensed architect, and my role at the National Center for State Courts is senior architect. I'm in the facilities planning division. So, we advise on new court facility projects, like Alicia was saying, existing historic buildings sometimes that need improvement. So we do a whole range of things. So I think we could jump right in.
Yeah, definitely. And so because of that, Allie, and the perspective that you have generally and as a court architect specifically, what can you tell us about what the different projects that you've worked on and the relationship between environment and the client perspective or the court user perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So this is a really interesting subject for me. And to answer your question, what is the link between those two things? I think evidence-based design research has proven that our physical environment has a profound impact on how we feel and behave. So given that, the design of our space matters, and it impacts our decision-making ability. And real quick, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term evidence-based design, what that is a process of basing design decisions about the built environment on rigorous research to achieve the best possible outcome. So these are actually, I won't say it's quantitative, but it's definitely a research-based approach. And there is a really great article that I hope, you do have that. Alicia's showing me that you do have access to that article. It's called Peace in Place Project, Building Healing Spaces. And so that's something that if you have an interest in the subject, I encourage you all to take a look at.
Perfect. And we'll also mention, as Scott just did in the pod, that we also have a fantastic article that Alicia Summers contributed to, along with Sean Marsh and some others. And throughout this talk today, we'll be making reference to some of those points as well. So.
Okay.
Thanks you.
Yep. Okay. There we go. So, given the nature of your work, I know you're all familiar with what trauma is. You also know that these experiences cause an overwhelming sense of terror and helplessness in individuals. Therefore, it's our responsibility to do all we can to provide a sense of comfort for those who are coming to visit our facilities. And so just a real quick recap, and I know this is probably nothing new to our audience, but, various types of traumas. And I think rather than going through each one of these one by one, because you are all familiar, I think it's more important for this conversation to link the causes of trauma to our physical environment. So, how might we do that? Go to the next slide. So here, this to me is the connection. So this is about what are our biological responses to our environment. Our physical space has the ability to affect moods, attitudes, and decision-making, like we've already said. When an individual feels a lack of control in their environment, their attitude and ability to make decisions is greatly impacted. Therefore, we would like to promote compassion and cooperation between parties. And just for your information, some of the quotes that you're seeing on these slides are pulled directly from the article that I referenced earlier. Okay, so then what is trauma-informed space? Trauma-informed space is a thoughtful environment that feels safe. It's also a process that doesn't create additional stress. And also an environment that doesn't create additional stress. And also, when designing spaces, we're making sure that we create an environment that doesn't cause trauma triggers or that minimizes trauma triggers. So how might we do that? And these are just a few sort of high-level ideas for you all to consider. So in thinking about how an individual will move through the court facility, we need to think about when they arrive and what their experience is really from the moment that they park their car or get out of public transportation. So we need to have thoughtful wayfinding and signage really from, the very beginning of their experience.
And Allie, you were talking about one of the examples that you were giving about some of the work that you've done is like, actually having the court user perspective so that when you walk into the courthouse, there's, you're having somebody like a third party come in and experience what it's like to come in and to try and find their way to a certain courthouse.
Right. So if they, really what we want to do is we want to minimize the stress of figuring out where you're supposed to be. So we want to make that as obvious as possible. And also, just on that subject, keeping in mind ADA compliance and making sure that those with disabilities are are recognized, and then making sure that multiple languages are represented through the signage. Okay, so in addition, when creating a safe environment, some of the high-level considerations are that clearly victims need to have a safe place to wait where they're away from any defendant who might be there. We don't want them to cross paths circulation-wise, if at all possible, but really, most importantly, a separate waiting area. We want to make sure that all visitors feel safe coming into the building. From the moment that they enter and they're going through security, also when they're in courtrooms and other waiting areas, and upon entry to the facility, making sure that we have the appropriate screening and monitoring available.
And certainly, by all means, if you've got a fantastic example of a way that one of your courts have been able to achieve that, definitely let people know, because like I said, we were having a hard time finding examples of where this is really being done right so far.
Yeah, I know that it definitely is a focus in what we are doing currently, and definitely a focus in new facilities, but Alicia's right. Finding images and photographs of, well-done areas of a building, they're hard to come by because this is somewhat new. Construction takes time, so there's a lag time. So hopefully in the next few years, and when we start to see the construction of these new facilities, we'll have better images available.
Beautiful.
So just real quick, in terms of environment, some things to think about in creating an environment where people don't feel that lack of control, and the lack of control, we all know, is what really causes stress. Providing access to the outdoors, if at all possible. Definitely natural light whenever we can. Just having some amenities available to make people more comfortable. If that's access to food and beverages, that's great. Reading materials so that people can take their mind off of what they might be there for just a few minutes. Artwork that is appropriate. I know that I was reading about this, and some of the most appropriate artwork might be nature-inspired. And then being sure that the temperature is comfortable. There's nothing worse than sitting in a waiting area and freezing or being too hot. So those are hopefully simple things that we could take into account.
And the proverbial candy that's always available in mediation rooms.
So, something else to consider is how our technology might be able to simplify some of our processes. When folks come to a court facility, that could be informational kiosks. That could be an actual human who's there to help answer questions and direct people. The other important part of this is making sure that there's a place for attorneys to meet with their clients privately, rather than being in hallways, like they so commonly are, trying to have private meetings in a public space.
Definitely. I know that one of the things that we'd also talked about is the fact that, that with the frequency of hearings, we certainly encourage, or National Best Practices has a preference for frequent hearings. However, one of the elements to keep in mind from a space perspective is that parking in many cities is at least $20 or more per day. And so to the extent to which hearings can be made as meaningful as possible, and there's nothing wrong with utilizing technology as much as possible to be able to allow people to participate by phone or by camera. So hopefully they don't have to come into the space. And that's certainly a cost-saving measure that a lot of courts have applied. Back to you.
Yeah, so another thought that is interesting is to, really think about child-friendly spaces and amenities related to that. And one thing that comes to mind is recently I was in Cook County and touring some of their facilities, and they have actually implemented child care amenities in, I believe, all of their circuit court buildings. And this is a photograph of one area within those. You know, and I think it's really great for families who have to come to court and maybe can't afford childcare, or it's incredibly inconvenient to get their children to, you know, a safe place to stay for the day. So that's a really wonderful amenity that they were able to offer.
Yeah. And Colorado, for example, Allison Young can speak more to this, but has a voucher for childcare so that when parties come in, so, you know, other jurisdictions may have that as well. Do you have that too, where you're actually providing childcare for people coming to court? Go ahead and answer that, and we'll keep talking.
And hi, this is Allison Young. Hi, Alicia. Hi, Allie.
Hi.
Great name.
Hi.
You ladies are doing great. We do have that in Colorado, and there's a process that districts have to go through to apply for the funds, but it's definitely the feedback that we get from having that actual resource in place outweighs the process to get it. So, yes, definitely, if other, you know, jurisdictions are considering that and looking for grants to possibly obtain those funds, it's a great, great, great resource.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Allison.
Yeah, okay, so then, you know, just to recap, so what are best practices to reduce trauma in the design of facilities? We've already talked about wayfinding and signage, making sure that victims and offenders are separate. When it comes to environment, making sure that natural light is brought into the building, hopefully access to the outdoors, which I know can get a little bit complicated when you're thinking of security issues, but if there's a way to do that, it's wonderful. Making sure that there's ample space in waiting areas so that parties have enough room to be separate. Also ample space in hallways. You don't want people walking and bumping each other as they pass. In general, a safe environment, I think that goes without saying. Appropriate art selections, appropriate finishes and furnishings, and just keeping the temperature of the space in mind. Those are some things that, you know, some of those have to do with new construction, but some of them are things that can be implemented relatively easily.
Perfect. Talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that people often come up against. You know, the budget. It is no small matter to build a new courthouse. I mean, that's a lot of money. And, you know, and sometimes it's difficult for one program, for, you know, say the court improvement program, to advocate for space. But we have some ideas on that too.
Yeah, so we thought it would be good to just highlight the reality of doing, you know, almost any project in a court facility. So like Alicia said, project budget is just always something to consider. As most of you probably know, when it comes to facility planning, budgets are usually managed through the county. And reconciling those budgets with programmatic needs is not an easy thing to do. So it's important to educate and advocate for wellness in the design of spaces. It's really important for those who have an interest and a passion in this to be a part of the process initially. So, you know, I think the sooner that you get on board and start expressing your views when you hear of a project starting, the more likely it is that wellness will become a priority in the project.
Definitely. And we also wanted to, you know, let people know, so there are a couple of those articles that are attached. Like we were saying, perhaps the recognition of trauma-informed space is something sort of new in the court community, but it's cutting edge. So perhaps you're able to bring this to the attention of some of the, you know, the people that are particularly involved in the process. Perhaps those articles help you. And, you know, and certainly you're free to reach out to any of us and to Allie if you want to do a little brainstorming in terms of how you can advocate for your space.
Yeah, so real quick, and actually I think we've already touched on all of these. So this is just a reminder of, you know, what are some things that you might be able to implement more realistically in your existing facility. And I won't go through all these because I think I've probably already addressed all of them, but just keep in mind that, it doesn't necessarily take the design of a brand new facility to implement some of these. There are some things that are hopefully within reach for you.
And we get to turn now to the example of Iowa and to Kathy Thompson, who's actually going to talk about the trauma assessment that you performed, Kathy, or that Iowa performed, and what your experience was from that.
Okay. Melissa, I think you were going to jump in, yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to help set sort of the foundation for Kathy's discussion about how she's operationalized some recommendations that they received through a trauma assessment or audit. Many people are aware that the National Council developed a protocol. Our expert research folks collaborated with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in 2013 to develop a protocol and an approach to evaluate court environment, practices, and policies to gauge whether or not they were trauma-informed. To date, we've performed over 30 of these assessments across the nation to be able to provide information on how courts can improve experiences of children and families they serve, and as well to identify areas in which courts can make changes to ensure that those practices, policies, or environmental recommendations are addressed. Part of that has also been to look at how to best support court personnel and judges that are encountering cases in secondary trauma. So there are recommendations around that. The way we've approached this assessment process is by sending our expert staff and sometimes consultants to perform an assessment, which takes a couple of days, and we're on site doing court observation, case file review, and as well as interviews with stakeholders. And early in 2017, we had an opportunity to visit one of the courthouses in Iowa and make some recommendations. And Kathy's now going to talk about how they've been operationalizing those recommendations in her state.
Thanks, Melissa. As Melissa mentioned, this opportunity presented itself in the spring of 2017, and Polk County jumped on it right away. They acknowledged that different disciplines or stakeholders, everyone had received separate training on becoming more trauma-informed, but what that resulted in was just oftentimes independent parallel efforts to really implement what they learned from that training, and there wasn't this coordinated effort to really step back and take a look at a big picture, a systemic picture of the whole process. And so they acknowledged that they were using the adverse childhood experiences and everyone had been through the ACEs training, but then what do you do with it? How do you use this information? How can we engage with families early on with screening to really start to identify and address maybe what some of their needs are from the get-go? And as we've been talking about today, a lot of that is can be addressed with the environment. So basically, I was incredibly interested in this from the standpoint of Polk County being our largest metropolitan county, that I was excited that they jumped on this, wanted to be on the early stages of this, but I'm interested in how we can replicate this across the state to other counties and courthouses. I think there's room for us to do better in all 99 counties. And so even though Polk County is big, they're, in terms of other counties, resource rich. What can we take from this? And so really, It can be anything from some small efforts, small change, to a larger scale efforts like what we're doing in Polk County. But all of it begins with a discussion and really taking the time to look at it from the perspective of the families that we're serving and what might this be like for them. Also keeping in mind the professionals and what we do to support them as they do this difficult work. So previously, the timing of this was critical. Previously, all court hearings took place in a courthouse. As mentioned earlier, many are very old buildings that you try and make yourself fit within those walls, if you will. So everything in Polk County happened in the old courthouse. It was overcrowded. There weren't enough courtrooms, and those courtrooms that were delegated for juvenile matters were so small, oftentimes there wasn't even enough seating for all of the participants who arrived for the hearings. So everybody was cramped. There was no private area for attorneys to talk to their clients, so there was confidentiality issues. There just were a lot of challenges. And they had just moved into a brand new space for them. It was an old department store that closed, and they retrofitted it for the juvenile court services that are available in Polk County. So county attorneys are located in there. We have juvenile court services and some other clerk's offices. But it finally gave some room for larger courtrooms that really were able to better meet the large number of people who do participate in juvenile hearings. And so this new space is larger. There's a large waiting area. There's natural light that comes in. And there was a designated child-friendly space that was just very institutional. But what this did in May of 2017 was give a report and a place to start to be able to move forward. So it took place over 2 days. It included some observation of hearings, a visit to the Justice Center, stakeholder interviews, and they were able to really take a look at, from beginning to end, what someone might experience in terms of screening, the overall environment, and really how the court interacts with the participants and stakeholders. What resulted in this was, and they did do surveys, what resulted is a report back to us that we've been working on since then to help guide us in our changes. Some of the things that I didn't include in slides, but I'll quickly talk about is some of the strengths and trauma-informed practices that they noted in the report prior to the recommendations. This is downtown. There is public transportation available. The noise level, it was very peaceful. It was very loud in the old building. The lighting was bright. Temperature was good. Comfortable seating. Adequate waiting space. And they had separate attorney client meeting rooms that were separate from that waiting area. So there's several of those rooms available. They also noted the use that we've had some trauma-informed training, so people seem to have a foundational level of information about trauma, but it's like where do we take it from there? Some of the things that were suggested as recommendations, I just looked at the clock, speeding up a bit. Some of the things that were recommended is to adopt a universal precaution model throughout the court system. So thinking more broadly, what needs to happen in terms of creating this trauma-informed space? We've been looking at creating a trauma-informed care Bill of Rights and trying to determine what that might look like. But that is something that will guide all of us as we move forward. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of training for staff, from judges and attorneys to the professionals providing direct services to the families, but what we didn't really consider in the beginning was, what about the security staff? What do they know about trauma-informed care? Let's provide training to them so they can be thinking of this in terms of their interaction with the court participants. Also, oftentimes clerks, really engage with the public the most, but we've never offered that training to the clerk staff. So it's like, how do we look beyond the immediate people to everyone who may interact with courthouse participants and provide training for them? We also noticed that some of the training in the beginning was one size fits all, and what we've been trying to do is do more discipline-specific training so we can take into consideration the special nuances for each discipline, and yet have a consistent message or consistent theme throughout. And then how to identify, everyone knows it can't, just do training and expect everything to be different, but then what efforts do we need to put in place to be able to support the information we gain through that training? How do we know if we're really implementing this? How do we keep ourselves accountable to what we've learned and what we've agreed upon? We also indicated that there were a lot of trauma screenings being implemented by different stakeholders here. We had Juvenile Court Services doing a trauma screen. We have DHS and the providers from the child welfare side of things doing a trauma screening. So it was taking an inventory of what is everyone using. Is there a way we can agree upon one that meets everyone's needs? And then once you do the screening, what do you do with that information? How do you make sure that is a part of developing what needs to happen for each individual family? How do we use this information? And really, how is it shared and who is it shared with? So just talking through how do we use this information to the best of our ability to meet each individual family's needs. I talked a little bit about exploring ways for the communication to happen and really how the courts can make sure that that information is being shared and it isn't just all being independently held. One thing that was pointed out to us is when you come into the Polk County Juvenile Justice Center, there is screening that, quite frankly, I think is more sensitive than TSA at the airport. But it was observed that there was a lack of female deputies, and many of our families we have moms coming, and there was males who, should they set off the screening machine, it was a male who was either patting them down or using that wand, and that in and of itself could be so traumatizing for that person that, they really may not get anything out of, their court hearing that day. So talking with our sheriff's department to see what we can do to increase the female deputies at that initial security point, to hopefully have them available should the machine go off, that they are the ones that would engage with the moms who are coming to court. With the downtown metropolitan area, I know a lot of people experience this. Parking is at a premium. As I think Alicia said earlier, it's very expensive. We have issues with that, with not only the people coming to the courthouse, but also our judges no longer have any secured parking. So we're looking at security for everyone involved in safety. What can we do? So we're working with the county on that right now to see what we can do to improve that. We're looking at creating a map, if you will, that will identify easily accessible parking lots, ramps, whatever that we can identify as being less expensive than some of the others. Our meters are really pretty expensive in the street side parking, and our meter readers take their jobs very seriously, and they're very prompt when the meter expires. So we're trying to find ways to really take that out of the mix for everyone involved. We also had a recommendation of enhancing the educational materials that were available. There was really never a good centralized place at the old courthouse. And now that we have a little additional space in the new Juvenile Justice Center, we're identifying what materials should be available, providing that in multiple languages, and then looking at who will maintain that information. So if we run out of some of the materials, who will take it upon themselves to restock them, if you will, and identify new materials that should be placed there. We also want to know how we can get feedback from participants and people who use the courthouse. So we're looking at addressing that recommendation with providing some computers available within the courthouse where people can take a survey, and looking at other opportunities to solicit that feedback. I mentioned a little bit about the child and family friendly space. When the new Juvenile Justice Center was being renovated, they did create this new large space that we do have furniture for little people or kids in a separate area, but it has stark white walls. So what we've done is invited some of the local high school art programs to submit a proposal to create some murals on those walls to make them more friendly and to be able to paint that space with some more soothing colors rather than the bright white. What all of the judges did in their individual courtrooms already, I think there was an example given earlier of Cook County and a child-friendly space. Each of the judges have created that in the back of their courtroom where there's books, there's toys, and they now have a courtroom where they can do that, which provides something for the kids to do during the hearing. The other thing that was just stood out like a sore thumb, if you will, is, we really didn't have any protocol in place to protect victims of domestic violence. We know that many of the families that were serving domestic violence is an issue, and yet here we are having mom and dad, just for a lack of defining further, sitting in the courtroom without anyone else present, and here's a no contact order in place. There was nothing really done to protect everyone. And so we now have identified safe space, and that we are putting together a protocol, and a small work group is putting that into policy, if you will. The other thing we noticed is, and we did get a recommendation on implementing a no shackle policy. Many of our youth who come under delinquency proceedings, they are shackled and chained throughout the proceedings, and it just wasn't necessary, and that is traumatizing in and of itself. So that has already occurred. We've got a new rule in place for court. And some of the things that were noted is making sure that before each hearing, there's a brief explanation of what everybody is gathered for that day, the type of hearing, what to expect, and for the judge to facilitate more conversations between the families and the children that are present about their well-being. How are they doing in school, health care, dental, all of that. Making sure there's ample opportunity to really engage about some of the child well-being issues. The judges, we have 6 judges who serve on the juvenile bench in Polk County, and they never have an opportunity to observe one another. And so we've been talking about ways to make sure that happens periodically. And they've reconstituted a routine, a consistent meeting between the judges who serve on the juvenile bench to talk with each other regularly and routinely about some of the issues, but some of the things they've implemented that are a strength or they're excited about, but they are so busy with their dockets, they, pass each other in the hall. But beyond that, there's no organized regular exchange between them about just what's happening in the courthouse. And engaging and going back to making sure that children are present for hearings. We went to drift on that. So some of the things that have taken place in November, well, we're coming up on a year. We convened a small work group, or a medium-sized work group, actually, with at least 21 members. We've added a couple more recently, who are working on the recommendations from this report and taking our next steps and work further. This is just a slide on who's all represented around the table. So we have a lot of the service providers, judges, attorneys, CASA, DHS, and some of our youth shelter services who are around the table. Purpose of the group is basically to take these recommendations and move forward in a way that we can really measure our progress and document what we've done, and which will help us replicate it elsewhere. As I mentioned just briefly a moment ago, we already have a no shackle policy in place, so youth aren't shackled throughout the hearings anymore. They are through transport, but beyond that, that doesn't occur anymore. We have artwork and high school students creating murals for us, so it'll kind of make it a softer setting. We have the community resource kiosk, which I underestimated what was involved in that. Working with the county on this partnership, they had this newly renovated space and they didn't want to hang anything. So the signage piece that we've acknowledged as a need and these resource kiosks, that was a bit more of a challenge than I expected. But we've made progress, and that's made available now. And as I mentioned, we're putting in place a domestic violence protocol that we will adhere to so we can have that safety piece in place. And then we're going to do a universal trauma screening protocol. And as I mentioned, I really want to replicate this in other counties. We have 99 of them, so I'll look for volunteers first. But as I mentioned, I think early in my remarks, this could be anything from small efforts to having the discussion about how can we make this a more trauma-informed process and space to large-scale efforts, and budget will be a part of it. But there are many things that can be done without actual funding.
That was excellent, Kathy. You brought up so many helpful, practical points. I really like your second to last slide. And I know, Scott, that you're going to do open space in just a second here, but let me just point out, I think that these are all some really actionable items that everyone can consider, regardless of your budget, or regardless of the scope of whatever type of redesign project is underway. So, Scott?
Yeah, we just we wanted to open up the call, as we usually do, if you have any other questions for each other on any topic. Just open. You have a lot of other CIP colleagues on here. Any questions for your peers? Any questions for us from the Capacity Building Center for Courts? We just wanted to set some time. So you could put those into the chat, or if you want to try over the phone. I had to mute a few people for background noise, so just check first that you're being heard. But we'll just give it a couple minutes if people think about their questions, and if we don't have any, then we can end a little early, but just give it a couple minutes if you need to type or formulate your thoughts. So we have one question in chat, I think, for some of our presenters. What is the cost of a trauma audit?
Hi, Kristen. This is Melissa Geller from the Capacity Building Center for Courts, and I'm also housed here at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. That really depends. We have tried to tailor it towards the needs of the jurisdiction. So if it's a larger jurisdiction, we may need to spend more time on site. So it just actually really depends. But if you would like more information, you can contact me at the National Council, and I'm happy to put you in touch with someone.
Kristen's asking if you know the range.
Again, dependent on the size of the jurisdiction, it can, so range-ish, I just saw that, it can be anywhere from $8,000 to $15,000.
What other questions does anybody have for other court improvement program staff that are on, or for us, Capacity Building Center for Courts? Any other questions about anything that maybe we can be helpful with since we're all here? See somebody typing? And if you want to just jump on the phone instead. All right, well, I think that we can end just a little early. Thank you to all the presenters and everybody for putting this together. I'll stay on the phone a few minutes longer if there's anything I could be helpful with, but thank you all for coming today.
Wait a minute, Scott, you almost forgot the polling part. We love the polls.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So we hope that we've given you some ideas for how your court can at least do no harm and even start to transition towards, more of a wellness, more of a preventative kind of environment. So yeah, take a second and let us know. And if you have any specific recommendations, we'd love to hear what one thing is that we can do to make this meeting more useful. So, thanks everyone.
Thank you.